break, we talked, or you did an activity called Jomo Kenyatta, or an interview with Jomo Kenyatta, and you learned quite a bit about some of the consequences. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about those as we go through the history of Africa and the rest of the things. But I wanted you to do that as an introductory so I can kind of go over these things briefly. And I will emphasize I'm going to go over them briefly, but then we'll get into them a little bit more in detail when they come back up with specific events in history. And the first thing that happened that you learned about was economic and political parties caused movement of people throughout the colonies. What that means is the people of Africa, or African descent, were transferred around the entire continent, generally within the colony that they existed in, but for the most part they were relocated, or if you were an African, you were dislocated. You were removed from your family. And a lot of those traditional ways of the family were broken apart, or they were challenged or abandoned because the society and the culture of that family unity, or that village, if you will, was broken apart. Mostly the males were dislocated. Okay, I'm using the word dislocated because they were not relocated. Relocation generally is a choice. Sometimes these were not choices. Okay. And we'll talk about why there was a lot of movement within those colonies a little bit later, but I want you to understand that people were dislocated away from their families and villages.
So would you say that most, if not all, the traditions were abolished about the family thing?
Only where that piece was. If the male wasn't there who had traditional male roles, and there were not a lot of males around to fill those roles, then that whole unity got broken up. Families were broken up, so that whole how the family works together is dissolved. So that goes along with the next slide, the dislocation of families. So they were split up by migration. If men were recruited to work in the mines, the plantations, they had to leave their families behind. Okay, there was a new way of society. Okay, with the European model, it was all about making money, not just making food for your family. So they had to transition their whole way of life around this European model of you've got to make money to purchase your food, to do this and to do that and to do all these other things, which wasn't the way of life with many of the Africans. So the family structure had to change because the Europeans changed how they viewed that needed to be changed. Hopefully that makes sense. Urbanization was another major key to this. This affects everything. The jobs available. It affects the lifestyle, the living arrangements. It challenged existing values, beliefs, practices, everywhere. If you think that's kind of like the farmer, you see it on American Idol, the little kid from, middle of nowhere that grew up on a farm in the middle of nowhere the entire life, and then all of a sudden they go to the city and all the big lights and everything. It's a culture shock. Some of you would live in, I wouldn't call this a big city, but if you were to actually go live on a rural farm in the middle of Omaha, Idaho, okay, Omaha's pretty much a city, but you get my point, it's going to be a culture shock. It's going to be like, oh my gosh, I've never done so much of this in my entire life. Okay? So that gets challenged of the way they live. Now, ironically, you think of Los Angeles, New York City as some big cities, right? Paris, Tokyo. The largest cities and the most developed cities in the world are in Africa. It's not a bunch of people living in villages anymore. Since the late 1800s, that urbanization has got some of the largest cities, and even in some cases more advanced than American cities. And you're like, but Mr. Prince, they haven't been around as long as we have, yada, 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 right? So think about trying to develop a brand new city in the modern era. Think about New York City. Their water that they still get into their apartments and all those other high-rise still gets pumped up to the top of their apartment building to put in tiny little water towers on the top to trickle down into the faucets. That's old school technology. All their buildings are wired for old technology. Those new countries in Africa and those places, they don't have to go from old to new. They just go, oh, we're going to build a brand new one? Oh, we're expanding? Hey, there's new technology. We don't need old phone lines. Many cities in Africa never even had pick up the phone telephones. Their first wave of communication that way was cellular. They never had dial-up internet. They just went from no internet to 5G wireless routers. They never had to plug in their computer. It was all Wi-Fi. They never had the transition. So that saves a ton of money, and you can do it bigger, better, and faster when you don't have to upgrade and upgrade and upgrade and upgrade. It's like going from no cable to all of a sudden going from over the air to, wow, we're just going to go ahead and get all this brand new wireless stuff. It's cheaper. There were some major religious changes. We already know that the Muslim religion was already heavily influencing Northern Africa even well before that. Up until even, at the end of days of the Egyptian rule, Islam had a major impact on Northern Africa. But now as the Europeans start to settle, they're going to bring what? Christianity. So Christianity starts to grow and grow and grow. The only place where this was a major impact or place of contention was mostly in the French colonies, who were mostly Northern Africa. They had a little bit more of that religious confrontation. Okay? Most Africans were already in the Muslim belief, and now they were bringing in Christianity. There was a little bit of difference. Those in the Southern Africa were not influenced by Christianity and were a little bit easier to convert, if you will. Education. Most education was, mostly Islamic. And it was mostly a religious-based schools. The students did not learn their local language. It was mostly Arabic. As the Europeans came in, obviously that's going to change a little bit. But if you remember, did the Europeans come in to educate? No, they came in to make money. And if we think back, is educating the population a wise thing to do if you're trying to control them? No. So there was very little influence of education, of what we consider a European education, in there. Colonists' ideas that they needed to be enlightened and civilized, but not educated. They started some schools, but they were mostly religious schools, where they taught about the Bible. They were teaching the stories, but they weren't teaching the reading, the writing, the math, the thinking independently. Because teaching a person to think independently is suicide for a colony, isn't it? If you think back to the American colonies, people started to ask questions, well, why do we have to pay this bill? Why? If you keep them from asking the question why, you can get them to do whatever you want to do. So any school that was there was only missionary work, and they were only taught enough so that they could do the bare minimum. No maximum was there. Consequently, many African children who went to school during the colonial time were very few. Very few. Schools did have an impact on those who were able to attend, and those that did attend, those that did learn, those that did read and begin to question things, became later on, once we get there, became the leaders of the revolutions in Africa. And we'll get to know some of those people more intimately a little bit later on. Any quick questions about Africa before I go on? Some of the problems that the Europeans caused? Yes?
Did Europeans obviously probably brought disease to Africa? Did that have a major
Not
impact?
as much disease, because most disease, if we go back to the history of diseases, were African-based. So smallpox, it was very limited, very, very few. In fact, it was actually the other way around. It was mostly the Europeans that went to Africa that caught some of the diseases and were having a hard time settling. If anything else, it was the opposite effect. All right. 1895 to 1947. We probably won't get that far with China today, but we're going to talk at least up until World War I. World War I, for those of you who didn't know, is about 1912, 1914. And if you go, why does that sound familiar? We talk about the pandemic. Remember the flu epidemic of 1914, which was at the end of World War I. So let's talk about China and how that looks after the Opium War. So after the Opium War, we talk about Japan, Russia, Germany, Great Britain, and France all looking to get those trading rights. Remember that Great Britain, with the Treaty of Nanjing, got control of ports. With control of ports, you get control of trade, but all these other countries wanted a little piece of the action as well. Does this sound familiar? Just like Africa. Except China's going to be a little bit, instead of a whole bunch of countries, they're only one country, and they can be a little bit more resilient in fending off the invaders, if you will. They did make China force through some concessions, but they weren't able to take it over like they did in Africa. So some of the things that they were able to do, Japan, Russia, Germany, Great Britain, and France, was the right to develop mineral mines after the Treaty of Nanjing. They had the right to build railroads, navy bases, and lease port cities. When we say lease port cities, they had to pay to bring their ships and those type of things in. It's like paying rent on a dock, if you will. So they were able to rent their own docks to trade in and out of China. Notice that there is no political control here.
So China forced those things?
No, China was forced to make these concessions. After the Treaty of Nanjing, Japan, Russia, Germany, Great Britain, and France kind of came in and said, well, if Great Britain's got these benefits, then we should too, or we can come in and force you under our control. So it's either you can go under our control, or you can open up your doors for trade more. Which one, if you were China, what would you do? Okay, I'll trade, right? Trade's better than control.
Well, the countries that threatened to control, why didn't they just control it? They could.
There was a lot of factors involved with mostly it would have been Great Britain. But at the time, Great Britain's resources were strung a little too thin, especially after all that they were doing in Germany, in France, and all that other thing. It was a little too difficult they were going to be spread too thin with their hand in Africa and in India. And really, what did they only want from China? is the goods. They didn't need any of those other things. They needed somebody to buy their stuff. They had everything they need. They just needed more buyers. So as long as they could get those buyers and the mines, then they'd be okay. Oh, and then obviously the United States was feeling left out. We're finally on our feet. The Great Depression is, we're getting there. We're trying to build our home country up, and we're feeling a little left out. The U.S. felt that their interests were being threatened. They proposed equal trading rights in China. They proposed a policy called the open door policy, that it wasn't an exclusive European club, if you will. So in 1900, this is just before World War I, okay? Civil War is over. We've just gone through the area of Reconstruction. The United States is back on their feet. We're unified, and now we're trying to be a world power. And the United States proposes the open door policy so that they can get their hands in China. This is one of our first attempts at breaking away from our own borders. Does that make sense? Major imperial powers agreed to respect trading rights. Treaties were unequal and unfair to China, but not to all the other world powers. So what was the effects of the open door policy? So somebody wanted, who's that somebody? Everybody but China, right? Everybody and China. So we have the major world powers now. The United States, Germany, France, Great Britain, a little bit of Russia, and a little bit of Japan want a piece of China. China's forced into these unfair treaties, and it increases foreigners in China. China remains free from colonial rule, but not from economic rule. Then that begs the question, which would be better, colonial rule or economic rule? It's neither one's a good answer, is it? Okay. So Japan eventually ignores the policy in the 1920s, just after World War I. And we're going to get into Japan a little bit later and why they began to ignore this policy of the open door. Okay. So keep in mind, Japan breaks the rules. But I wonder why Japan breaks the rules. Ask yourself that question and go, I hope he answers that later. I will. Yes, Maddie.
By ignoring the rules, do you mean like going in and colonizing everything, or just kind of ignoring China?
Not ignoring China, but I'm not going to answer that other question. I want to leave that hanging out there as a little carrot so that you learn more. Or when I bring it up, you go, oh, that's what he was talking about. I don't want it to be a spoiler alert yet. Yeah.
Is it because I remember this was on the timeline from some activity a while ago where Japan went in and massacred 300,000?
I have no idea.
Oh, yeah.
So I think I'm on something there.
Okay, now back to China, because we're talking about China. I'm leaving that carrot out there because I don't want it, because it hasn't happened yet. Okay, so obviously China's door is open. Their trade is open, forced open by the United States, who got their toe in there and then forced it open. So the Empress of China, you don't have to actually know who she is, but well, you have to know that there was an empress. Her name, not always important. You can always look that up, right? That's what Google's there for. But know that she's supposed to stand in as a monarch, but because, remember the whole, the manifest, Yeah, the mandate of heaven is kind of been dissolved. And it turns into more of a democracy, but the emperor or the monarchy of China has control, but not all the political control. But after the open door policy, the monarch starts taking over and starting to rule the government, starting to make snap decisions. So it's kind of like you have two political bodies in the same country doing different things. She was very corrupt, did not modernize the country very well, and secretly supported the Boxer Rebellion. So all those fighters, no, just kidding, there were no boxers. Okay, not like punching boxers, there are different boxers, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But you've got to realize that it was not the government of China, but it was the emperor that supported this whole rebellion. There's a lot of really great Chinese kung fu movies out there that deal with this whole thing. But the Boxer Rebellion was basically the peasants of China rebelling against, because of all these trade rules, they were making less money. Does that sound familiar? Okay. So now all of a sudden they were doing fine until the Europeans show up. Now the Europeans have these unfair trade rules, and now the peasants are missing out. So the Chinese nationalist movement looked to expel all foreigners. Who were the majority of the people in China? The peasants. I don't want to call them lower class because they're not a lower class, but they were a lower economic status. So they had an international force of 20,000 troops of England, France, Germany, Australia, Italy, Japan, United States. 20,000 people. We've got hundreds of thousands of boxers. Should be easy, right? All we have to do is kick out the foreigners. There's not that many of them. Kick them out, shut the door behind you. Lock the ports up again. However, despite the rebellion, China remained weak and divided because they had poor leadership and their military tactics and weaponry was inferior. So even though they tried desperately to kick out the foreigners, they failed miserably. And because of that, like anything, people in control go, well, we can't let that happen again. So they brought in more foreigners to make sure that there were no more rebellions. Why is this Boxer Rebellion important? Can you think of a couple ways why this is really important to Chinese history?
Unlike the United States and their rebellion, they were unable to kind of gain independence from countries that were political factions.
Sure. So they weren't able to be totally independent and were forced dependency. They're now very dependent on other countries. They fell into almost completely control of foreign nations. However, it does have one other major thing that increased is that sense of nationalism. We talked about that nationalism before. That's why other countries were so willing and able to make advances in other countries because of that sense of nationalism. If there's more pride in China, what might happen?
More people might want to start the rebellion.
They might start that rebellion again, and it does. So the dynasties are finally forced to accept the reforms in 1911, just before World War I. All of these reforms they had to go through to make sure that these rebellions didn't happen again. And the strong foreign presence remained in China until 1947. And for those of you who are doing the timeline, that's just after World War II. So something has happened between the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 and the end of World War II to remove the Europeans. But we're not to 1947 yet. So hold your horses. There's another carrot. I wonder what happened. It's killing Maddie. And others, I hope, are fighting at the bit. Just tell me what happened, Mr. All right. I'm going to skip this because this doesn't do that great of a job. It just basically goes in and shows how Great Britain went into the emperor and kind of got them to force the trade open, and it's a 2-minute video that's not worth it. So let's talk about World War I, 1914. Remember, we got 1911, end of the Boxer Rebellion. Well, not even 1911. 1900, end of the Boxer Rebellion. Next 10 years, and the rest of the world is pretty much the same old, same old. Until a very powerful person in Europe gets assassinated and causes a major world war. I'm not going to get into the cause of World War I because it's, for most of you who've studied World War I, it's probably the stupidest thing ever, right? All right. So Germany looks to control Europe and other colonies, and here's the outcome. By the beginning of World War I in 1914, all of Africa except for Liberia, and remember, why is Liberia free and independent? They didn't send the slaves, but it was given a choice from the United States. So that it's a United States protected country. Ethiopia was independent as well. Only 2 countries in Africa not colonized. African resistance had been tried, overthrown, very weak. By 1950s, they were finally actually organized. But at the beginning of the World War I, and that's what we're going to start with, is nobody was independent except for those 2 countries. So here we go. Everything. You've seen these maps before. The impact of Africa. Most of the fighting in World War I was in northern Africa, mostly north of the Sahara. Most Africans were drafted. They were forced to fight for their colonial powers. The military forces were redirected and weakened colonial powers. So most of those commanding officers who were in control of keeping the peace in Africa were sent to the front lines of World War I. So the peacekeeping, and I put that under quotes, peacekeeping powers of the colonial powers were not in Africa anymore. They were on the front lines. So who is in control? Subordinates, easily overthrown. But the other problem is most of the people who would be doing the rebelling in Africa were also on the front lines. Put yourself in somebody from Africa. You're part of the British Empire, and now you're said, oh, by the way, Great Britain is under attack by Germany. You have to come fight for us and save us.
Wait, wouldn't they like not help if they're either? Wouldn't they like shoot all the British people and help Germany?
Wait a minute. You control me, and because you're under attack, I have to fight your fight for you? Huh? Wait a minute. Hey, I'm going to get into a fight after school. Come with me and beat up the guy. Why? Because I said so, or I'll beat you up. Wait a minute. Something doesn't sound right. And that's why they begin to consider the impact of imperialism in their own country. Wait, I have to fight for you so that Germany doesn't take over you, but it was okay for you to take over me? Time out. Something's not adding up right. They learn new skills. Whoops, I keep going too fast. The Africans who were kept low, right, were then all of a sudden taught skills to survive in a war and to use the equipment properly. So now they were being educated, and with education comes rebellion, or if nothing else, power, right? There's power within education. So these skills and this technical education was able to advance their cause. So, Great Britain, France, United States, etc. finally defeat Germany in the First World War. What does that mean for the rest of the colonies? It means that they're still colonies. Germany lost most of its African colonies. Woohoo, we're free! Oh wait, no, we just have a new person in control. The Belgians took over Rwanda, Burundi, South Africa received Namibia, the British obtained Tanganyika and northern Cameroon. Does that make sense now why that final British map was the way it is? Basically from South Africa all the way up to Egypt, even though there was Germany in the middle. Okay, so your map that you finally did those many times was 1914, which means after World War I. So literally, it was split. Africa was kind of split down the middle because of Germany. But when Germany loses, now they divide up all that German property. The French take the rest of Cameroon. The British French divided Togo. You've seen those maps. Hopefully you noticed that some of those maps, Germany's not in it. Now you know why. There's a price tag for every war. The price tag comes in the form of education, in that questioning that we just talked about. The colonial powers shared one goal, is the economic exploitation of Africa. They saw Africa as a way of regrouping their losses and rebuilding their economies. So they try and take advantage of the resources to stop the spiraling inflation. So by the end of World War I, the colonists had managed to stop the efforts by Africans to resist colonial rule. So we just have to make our money back. War is expensive. Where can we make up the most money? Africa. Easy. We'll just increase our productivity from Africa. Simple. We'll make our money up that way. Yeah.
As of that last they did not try increasing yet in Africa.
Africa tried to resist, but because of the economic that is so valuable to the Europeans, they stepped up their game. The Europeans stepped up their game even more in Africa to make their money back. The next 2 decades between World War I and World War II were very quiet. And when I mean quiet, I mean they weren't happy with colonial rule, but there was less organization to resist it because there was even more of a foot, if you will, on the throat of the Africans. Does that make sense? Because they needed to make more money, the Europeans came in with more force into Africa to force them into submission. Okay. So they tightened up their grip a little bit more to make sure they squeezed every penny out of Africa. Because it was close, it was easy, and it was highly profitable. And they had huge war debts to pay. Not to mention the millions and millions of men that were lost. They were missing out on the labor. And all the machinery all the money they poured into it. And then the pandemic of 1914 hits, and that wipes out even more of the population. Oh, sorry. I'm going the wrong way, aren't I? And come on. Goodness. Might be able to get this in. World War II, or World War I. In 1914, the Ottoman Empire controlled all of North Africa and the Middle East. They were in alliance with Germany and Austria. Does that make sense? The Ottomans were Muslim, basically. They controlled much of the Middle East and Northern Africa. They became an alliance with Germany and Austria, and the Ottoman Empire was eliminated when Germany lost. Are you with me? there was one man, and we're going to learn a little bit more about Lawrence of Arabia probably tomorrow. And there was a whole really old movie. You probably have heard of it, Lawrence of Arabia. Maybe not. Some have. Some are going, who? We'll learn a little bit more about him. He was a British-born legionnaire. You've probably heard of the French legionnaires in Africa. Maybe not. But you will shortly. He helped defeat the Ottoman Empire in Africa, which allowed Germany to fall and the Europeans to get there. So why do I mention this tiny little piece of World War I history? Because to the winners go the spoils. And part of that spoils is all of the land that the Ottoman Empire controls. What do they control? Northern Africa and the Middle East. So now, all of this area of the Middle East has to get divided up. It was once under the Ottoman Empire, but now it's not under any empire. Turkey was a little bit part of the Ottoman Empire, but there's a little bit of history to it, but they became more independent. They were able to not be controlled. Does that make sense? And they're not considered technically part of the Middle East. They're considered part of Central Asia. So that's probably why it's not part of this map. But Turkey is a different story in itself after World War I anyway. Great Britain gains control of more land. In 1917, declaration says that Great Britain will support a Jewish home in Palestine, but there's no clear plan. And you're like, but Mr. Prince, Israel is there now, so why didn't they put Israel there? I'll give you a little hint. This is one of those carrots that I'll actually give to you right now. They said they would, and it wouldn't be until after the Holocaust that they went, okay, we'll make one. Does that make sense? So they said, yeah. We'll give it back to the Jews sometime. We'll work on a plan. We'll make it so everybody's okay with it. And then they never did anything until after World War II. And there's some history with that, and we'll get into that in a little bit. The Arabs were upset because they were not given an independent area as promised. The Ottomans were ousted, and the Palestinians were not specifically, or the Muslims were not given their own land. It was broken up. So, the British divide the region. Europeans getting into Muslim affairs divide the region. 1921, the British divide the region. Clashes break out because the Palestinians want control, the Christians want control, and the Jews want control of the one major important city of, where are all these places, the Wailing Wall, the Temple Mount, etc. Jerusalem. Everybody wants a piece of Jerusalem, but nobody, one group, can own it. So that causes some major tension, and the British are in charge. This is like putting three religions in the back seat of a Yugo. Okay, so you guys don't know what a Yugo is. A Honda Prius. A tiny little Prius. And we're putting three couple 100-pound men in the back seat, all of a different religion, and told to behave. How's that going to work? It's not going to work. And the British are in charge. They're driving the car, and they have to negotiate and make sure all three of them are there. So there was land for housing, but they went, okay, we'll give the Jews this land. Oh, wait, there's a Palestinian there. Well, we're going to take your house and make you move. That would be like East Lansing coming in and saying, okay, we're going to take over Okemos, and if you were an Okemos resident, you have to move to Williamston. And we're going to put in East Lansing citizens and MSU students because we don't have enough room for them. So you're going to have to leave tomorrow. That doesn't go over very well, and even today, that's still an issue of neighborhoods being taken control of by Jews, and then by Palestinians, and then back to the Jews, and then back, and people are getting forced in and out of their homes, and in and out of their homes, and can you imagine how, wait, this isn't my shirt. By 1933, Hitler rises to power. You're not going anywhere yet? We gotta wait till the, got 5 minutes. I have 5 minutes. Give me 5 minutes. So 1933, Hitler rises to power. All bets are off and the Jewish settlements increase. He starts setting up the ghettos. People start leaving the ghettos. And in droves, the Jews who can see the writing on the wall, seeing that they're not welcomed in Europe anymore, leave quickly as in an exodus, and they're like, well, Great Britain said we could have some of it. We don't know where, so let's just go, and we'll figure it out when we get there. So now we have a huge influx of Jews into the Palestinian area pre-World War II, and you have a whole bunch of Palestinians going, why are they all coming here? Oh yeah, that's right, Great Britain said they could. And now Great Britain has to be the peacemaker between the Jews and the Palestinians, and they can't. So they say, all right, no more Jews allowed in here. We have to put down the Muslim revolts. How's that going to go over? You see why this is a fight that you can't control from the front seat. In 1921, just before World War II, this is British-controlled world. All the places in red are the places that Great Britain controlled. And you now see why some of you did the activity. This is Cecil Rhodes. He is a British, really important guy, if you will. He's the one who set up Rhodesia of the British Empire. Why would he be standing on Africa like this? That's all that he controls. How many of you have heard of a Rhodes Scholar? You've heard of somebody being a Rhodes Scholar? They're like, oh, so-and-so and a Rhodes Scholar. It's supposed to be a really big deal because only few people can get a Rhodes Scholar. That means like you're really smart about a lot of things in the world. Okay? And only a few people in the highest universities become a Rhodes Scholar. It's kind of like being a valedictorian of all of the colleges in that year. Does that make sense? Okay, you guys know what a valedictorian is, right? So a Rhodes Scholar is the smartest of the smartest each year that comes out of many of the colleges around the world. He is the one who started the Rhodes Scholar program. Just as a tidbit of information. And he, back in the 20s, was like, you know what? Great Britain should control everything. And he was a firm believer in that idea of that power.
What are those like red lines?
The red lines at the bottom is they were now getting into the exploring Antarctica and trying to control those pieces of Antarctica for research. And